Andy Chrisman of For Him has spent 40 plus years in Christian music, and chances are he knows your favorite artist personally. Now he's bringing you their stories.
I'm Andy Chrisman.
In his new podcast, 1 Degree of Andy, he sits down with the voices behind the songs for real, honest, and faith-filled conversations you won't hear anywhere else.
That's a great question.
If you love Christian music, this is your backstage pass.
The 1 Degree of Andy podcast.
Listen now to 1 Degree of Andy wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Alzheimer's Speaks Radio. I'm your host, Lori LeBay, and I'm so excited that you're joining us today. We are going to have a fascinating conversation, as usual, as we learn from people all around the world at all ages and stages of life. Stay tuned as we shift our dementia care from crisis to comfort.
Here we go. What you think about, you will bring about.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to Alzheimer's Speaks. I'm thrilled you can join us today. We're going to be talking with Dan Cohen, who has written this beautiful book called Awakenings in Real Life. He also has a podcast regarding that, and he just has a fascinating journey that he is sharing with people and exploring the beauty of life and the overlaps of caregiving to other things in your life. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So before I introduce you to him, I always encourage people to check out Alzheimer's Speaks and go to our free educational resources, as well as our sister company, Dementia Map, which is our global resource directory. And maybe you have a service product or tool that you would like listed in there. We would love to have you join us. We have both free and paid options there. And then I always like to give a shout out to Q for Good. They're my webmasters, and I adore them. They reduce my stress, they're economical, and they meet their time frames that are set. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and meet Dan. Well, Dan, I'm so excited to have you with us today. We've been talking for a while. I've admired your work and your voice in the industry. I think it's really important for the family's voice to be heard. And that's kind of why I created Alzheimer's Speaks. Was I really felt strongly that we needed to get the people with dementia and the family members' voice equal to those of the medical and academic professionals and researchers, because we have so much knowledge. Even though we don't think we know anything, we know a lot, as we kind of struggle our way through this learning curve, this ball that's been thrown to us. So will you introduce yourself to our audience for us, please?
Sure. My name is Dan Cohen, and I recently wrote a book called Awakenings in Real Life about my dad's experience awakening from his dementia, which we'll talk about. From that, it also led me to a podcast where I talk about other people's awakenings. I spent my life and career as an entrepreneur, but after this event with my dad, I decided I wanted to share it, and it's almost like brought me a new passion in life to want to share his story and our experience with him, as you said, as family members.
Okay, wonderful. Do you want to tell us just a little bit about your dad, maybe a little bit what he was like prior to the disease, when he got the disease?
Sure, I'd love to. My dad was a very big presence in my life. People, he was my hero. He was my confidant. He was my problem solver. He had a very big personality. He exuded love, especially to his children and his wife. He was very demonstratively loving. He grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and he was more street smarts guy. He never went to college, but he took that street smarts. He made a successful business. He really revolutionized telemarketing. He was the first one who started to sell products typically that were in person over the phone. So in my book, it's interesting. The last chapter of my book, I write, "Who is your one?" because I talk about my dad in the book. And I think there's no statute of limitations of having that one person in your life. And they're not necessarily a hero, but the one person who has no ego when it comes to you. They want you to succeed, and it doesn't matter in relation to themselves. It's typically a person that loves you unconditionally. But, and it could be a parent, it could be a sibling. Usually, it's not usually a child, hopefully, looks like you, that it could be a friend. But I don't think there's an age when you can have it. So when we lost him, when he eventually passed, that was a big hole in my life. So my dad got dementia when he was 75 years old when he had a stroke. So my brother is a physician, and his office, his partners treated my father. He happened to be walking into my brother's office, and they knew right away he was having a stroke because they knew the signs. Stroke is you can't smile. One part of his face was drooping. They knew immediately he was having a stroke. Within 10 minutes, they had him in the hospital. They stopped the bleeding in his brain. He recovered decently after that. He was able to converse. He was able to drive a car. He was able to use his cell phone. But over the next 10 plus 11 years, he developed dementia. And I don't have to tell you, dementia runs in stages. So he didn't have Alzheimer's, and I know that's the title of your program. And but as you know, and I'm sure you've discussed this with your audience, dementia is the symptoms of things like Alzheimer's. But dementia can also be caused by certain diseases, blows to the head, vascular dementia. So, it's the cognitive decline over time. So that's what happened. He developed dementia. And that person who I love so dearly and such a big presence started to fade over time.
Yeah, it's well, when I started this, there was no one used the word dementia. It was all we heard about was Alzheimer's. So, but when my mom died, we found out we had her brain autopsy. She had Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Lewy body. And the other two were never mentioned to us the whole 30 years she lived with it. So some people get multiple types of dementia too. And I think we're still and this is my personal belief, baby stages of diagnosis, because there are so many people who get switched from one thing to another thing. Is it a progressive thing? We don't really know enough about it. It just, has a lot of twists and turns that we don't know. So.
And a lot of people don't, think there's a difference between Alzheimer's and dementia, and they don't really get the connection that dementia is the symptoms that happens when you have Alzheimer's, but there's a lot of other ways to get dementia. People used to use the term, I think, senility, which is really vascular dementia, right, over time. But a lot of people still don't understand that distinction at all. But there's a lot of ways to get dementia, and his way was from the stroke,
which is extremely common.
Right.
Common. I mean, some
Yeah.
people get it going into surgery, and maybe they've had it and no one's really picked up on it enough, and all of a sudden the anesthesia brings it out too. So
Right.
there's alcohol. I mean, we don't really know how many there are. Everybody I ask gives me different numbers. I've heard over
Really?
100 different forms of dementia. So yeah, it's very interesting. A lot of the symptoms overlap from one to the other, and many times people will get, as you know, diagnosed with maybe mental health. Oh, you're depressed, or it's just you're going through a different stage, and because it's really hard to pin down for sure.
And as you get older, you go natural. You age naturally. Sometimes you forget words and things, and it's to make that distinction. I'll tell you something just from my personal perspective. Like you said, I'm not a medical professional. I don't come at it from that realm at all. But dementia has 7 stages. I never worry too much exactly what stage he was in. I'm sure there are people out there that consult with their neurologist or the physician. Is my loved one in stage 2 or 3 or 6 or 7? I just felt I knew what was going on with my dad. I knew where he was. I knew where his short-term memory is. I knew how it affected him physically. I didn't need the extra angst that would cause by knowing the specific stages. I guess it's up to the individual, but when I tell someone, as I said, don't get so caught up on which stage. You know probably best. You see a doctor, they can diagnose it from a clinical point of view, but caregivers typically, live with the person or see the person often. So that's just my take on that.
Well, I'm very much with you. In fact, we're in the process of placing a loved one in memory care, and the doctor's like, "Well, what stage?" And I said, I don't evaluate her by that. I said it's fluid. Some
Right.
days, and I've interviewed tons of people living with dementia over the years too, and they say the same thing. I can be a stage 7 one day, and I can be a 5, and then I'll have a really good day, and I'll be down here. It changes. And
Well,
granted,
that's interesting.
there's those step off moments where it's not coming back again.
Right.
But again, to me, that's focusing on the loss instead of what's there. And I think I'm like you about living life fully, finding the joy, giving hope, and appreciating what you have before you in every moment. And I also hear from people, because I do a lot of support groups as well, along with interviewing people here, is many of them stop seeing the neurologist. They're like, they're not helping me. The medical terms aren't helping us live well with dementia. And so many of them back off from going to those appointments, especially if they figure they're at a point where they don't feel the medications are helping
No.
anymore, and the testing. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, because we want the statistical information to help people in the future, but then people kind of question, where's that information going, and is it really helping people in the future, or just that clinic or just that doctor? And so I think we have to learn to communicate better and figure out what do we really need to help people in the future, and is everybody using the same criteria basis and stuff? Because there's a lot of biases even with the medical professionals out there, as well as family members. Many families, I don't know about yours if you have siblings. I have 2, but they thought I was cuckoo. It's like, mom's fine, and I'm like, okay, you were here 15 minutes.
Right.
You're not seeing the whole day. Dad and I are seeing this on a
Right.
different level, and so
Yeah.
depending on where everybody's coming from, makes a huge difference there.
That's interesting because the person that was most exposed to it was my mother. She lived with my father every day. And, towards the end, we brought in help in the house. But my mother seemed to be the last one between myself. I'm the middle child. I got an older brother who's a doctor and a sister. She was the last one that seemed to catch on, and she was exposed the most. I found that she always thought he was more capable than he was, and I wonder why that was. Is that we saw it clearer than she did. I don't know if it was just a hope or she was so used to the man he was, but she seemed to catch on the least of all
I
of
think
them.
it's the power of denial. They don't
Okay.
want their life changing. They want their loved one and their dreams, their hopes of everything that they had planned on, for later in life. They don't want to give those things up. I've seen that many times as well too. And then usually there becomes a point where there's a health issue or something that's you can't deny anymore. That's like, okay, this is what's
Yeah.
here.
You're right. You talked a couple of minutes ago about the stigma, right? The
Mhm.
mental health has a stigma. So it's interesting. I besides talking about, we'll get into my father's awakening. I talk about other family stories because reflecting on his awakening allowed me to reflect on other things. But I also have a chapter in my book, and I said dementia cured my father's OCD. Okay. Now, my father lived with OCD his whole life too. But after he had his stroke and had his dementia, his OCD symptoms went away. It's almost tongue in cheek. But part of that chapter, I was saying, part of the thing they do in like OCD therapy is they ask the patient to name the OCD. So some people call it controlling or aggravating. I joke around that my father would have called it, we're New York Jets football teams, Jets, 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 because he was a long-suffering Jets fan and made him suffer. But the point is that it's a part of your brain that's not working, not the person yourself. So that should be the case with all mental disease and illnesses, whether it's Alzheimer's, dementia. It's a person who has the condition, not the condition itself. So it's another
Yeah,
thing that I experienced.
Caring for someone with dementia is one of the toughest journeys, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm Allison Schreier, and my experience caring for my husband inspired me to create Zinnia, a therapeutic streaming service designed to support people living with dementia and reduce caregiver stress. Zinnia offers research-backed videos intentionally created for people with dementia, engaging, calming, and easy to follow. Whether you need to ease agitation, create moments of joy, or make daily routines smoother, Zinnia is here to help. Family and professional caregivers use our content to turn challenges into opportunities for connection. Accessible by subscription on mobile devices and connected TVs, Zinnia is simple to use whenever you need it. Because when caregiving feels easier, life feels better. Go to zinniatv.com and sign up for a free trial today. Use the code RESOURCE for 15% off an annual Zinnia subscription.
yeah, that's a huge stigma to get over. And people with dementia say, I was like this before I had dementia, or I enjoyed this before. Don't blame everything onto the dementia. And a lot of times, health issues, sometimes severe ones, can get overlooked even by medical professionals going, oh, it's just the disease. And it's like, no, it might be another disease or another medical condition
Very
at
interesting.
there.
Yeah.
So, well, let's talk about your dad and this awakening in dementia. I'm really looking forward to this because I feel like I had that experience with my mom as well, who lived with the disease for 30 years. So why don't you explain what an awakening to you is and what you experienced there?
So you know what? So I didn't really study what an awakening was till after the event because it helped me in other areas. So I'll start with what happened. So my father passed away in April 2016, but in the summer of 2015, he was hospitalized twice with pneumonia. And the second time he had pneumonia, he was also hypertensive. I think I got that right. So they loaded him up with steroids and antibiotics. Okay. So he's in the hospital. Now, at this point, he was incontinent, basically didn't speak at all. Maybe you'd get a word or two out of him, right? Needed help getting dressed and washed and fed, and really was a shell of the man he was. He was pretty amiable through most of the process, but I know a lot of people, they get meaner as it goes on. He was never really mean, but when we would shave him or change him, he would cry out in pain. It's very hard to hear your father cry out in pain when you know they're not in pain. So I walk into the hospital room and he says, "Hi, Danny." And I said, "Hi, Dad." And he says, "I love you very much." I said, "I love you very much." He says, "What happened to me?" And I said, "Well, you have pneumonia, you're being treated, and you're going to go home shortly." Then all of a sudden it dawned on me, this is not the same person that I saw a few days ago or a week ago. This is a person that seems to resemble my father before the stroke. And I said to myself, maybe he wasn't asking me what happened to me, but maybe he was saying, what happened to me these past 10 years? So it was really incredible. My brother, who's partner was my father's primary physician, had admitting privileges to the hospital, so he was there a lot. And my father was awake or had this experience for 2 days. And it was truly remarkable. If I had to put it in percentages, I would say he was probably 90% the man that I remember. My brother says the bar was so low that he came back so high. He didn't put it in percentage that all of a sudden he's having full conversation. So it wasn't a momentary recognition. It wasn't, people have said to me, was it terminal lucidity? When right before someone passes, sometimes these people have a period of time where they're awake or more cognizant. Now, this was 8 months before he passed away. So it was truly remarkable. And if you'd like, I could share some of the things we experienced in those 2 days with my dad.
Please do.
So one of the things is he says to before I tell you this part, I also have a chapter in the book and I call it Perspectives. So you talk about my relationship with my dad. I used to think there's nobody on this planet that has a better relationship with him. We're very much alike, similar sense of humor. I like to think I have some of his personality. Nobody on this planet can have the relationship I have with him, even though he has other children. So at his 75th birthday party, from my mother down to the grandchildren, they all got to speak to my father. And when I heard my brother and sister speak, I realized that they felt exactly the same way about him as I did. He had that ability to make everybody in his life, especially his children and his spouse, feel very special. So this wasn't unique to me. And we go through life looking everything through our own lens. But if you could look at someone else's perspective in life, and this goes to a whole lot of areas in life, I think you'll have more empathy and appreciate more other people's perspectives and opinions. So I bring this up because he says to my brother at one time, he says, "I'm happy to have a son like you." And to my brother, who as a medical profession, he didn't only look at it from what I would experience, but he would research every possible medical angle of what was going on to the point where I think he was overwhelmed, and I don't think it was a good thing for him. He couldn't help himself. He probably knew too much. But to hear from his father, who was also that person in his life, say, "I'm happy to have a son like you," he talks about it as a seminal moment of his life. So it was really profound. Another really interesting thing is we started to share with him and update him on the grandchildren. And at one point, my dad says, "Didn't one of the grandchildren start medical school? And didn't one of the grandchildren start an Ivy League school?" And it was one from one sibling and one from the other. And that was exactly true. But Lori, here's the interesting part. Those events happened during the throes of dementia. Okay? So this was not something we just told him when he was awake. This is something he heard or he was privy to while he was in the throes of dementia. He also knew what hospital he was in, too, just by the surroundings. So it got us to think that maybe during whatever stages he was in dementia, that he was more aware of his surroundings and what was going on than most people think. And I thought that was remarkable because we really never know what person is going through if they can't articulate it. But this showed to us that maybe he's more aware of what's going on. So I found that pretty profound. Have you seen that in any of the other interviews you've done?
Yeah, I think, well, one of the things, like I said, I do this thing called Dementia Chats where I interview people with dementia. And they talk about, they relate it to like being blind. If you're blind, your other senses kick in. And they said, we always tell people, please look at us because we think they're reading our lips. And it's like, they're reading our lips, but they're reading all of our body language and all of these nonverbal things. And so I always tell people, think about when someone's in a coma. They'll tell you they're not going to be able to react, but they can take it all in. And I'm a firm believer in that. And I think our mind and body and soul are, I think they do things way on beyond our imagination of what is possible. And I've had moments like that with my mom, not for as long of period. I've had shorter periods and stuff, but I've heard of others, mostly people with like Lewy body, where they say that they're like totally normal, and then they just get zapped for, it can be 3 to 5 days. They can barely even get out of bed, and so everybody's symptoms are different. But
Right.
yeah, I think we have this spiritual connection, because my mom used to come to me in dreams before she died and afterwards, very, very vividly and stuff. And so I talk about it as being, we have these levels of unconditional love, and I didn't really know how many, and I've never like pinned them all down. I had them down. I wish I would have, because it would have made a great book. But because you learn to communicate and appreciate things on a different level
Yeah.
with this disease.
Yeah, absolutely true. So that was remarkable. At one point, my parents were married 62 years at that point. He tells my mother she's the love of his life. My father had certain quirks growing up. When he would take a nap, and maybe this is old school, he would put a long brown or black sock across his eyes to block out any light. So he's lying in the hospital. He says to my mother, Arl, her name was Arlene, do you have my sock? I want to take a nap.
So cute.
The other thing, my father, he was a pretty generous tipper. If you were, people were good to him, or certainly in a situation, he was a nice tipper. It didn't matter if we were lower mink. It doesn't matter what economic status we were. He was always a generous tipper. He's lying in the bed. He says to my mother, "Do you have any cash?" She goes, "What for?" Because I want to tip the nurses and the aides that was so nice to me. I mean, you can't. It's unbelievable. He reminisced. He was an undefeated boxer in the army. He was 26-0. He reminisced about his boxing career, how he was underestimated, and he related that to a football player that he loved. He loved the New York Jet football player called Wayne. His name was Wayne Corbett, who was undersized and really had a wonderful career, even though he was smaller than other players. And he says, like Wayne Corbett, I surprised my opponents. And then he reminisced about the holiday picture we took. I don't know if it was a holiday picture. He bought the number 80 jersey of the football player for all the grandkids, and it's one of my favorite pictures. I have it here, and it brought tears to his eyes when he was remembering the picture. We talked about Muhammad Ali and other athletes he admired. And what I try to do is I wanted to get my children there to see their grandpa the way they remembered. And unfortunately, I couldn't get them there for whatever reason to the end of the second day. And by that point, he had reverted back to his full-blown dementia. But my brother videotaped towards the end of the second day some of these things with my father. And we showed my daughter something that made her very emotional. And my brother says to my father, "What are you happy about?" And he said, "I'm happy just to be here and alive." And of all the things we experienced in the 2 days, that was probably what I thought was the most profound, because what I think he was telling the family is that even in the throes of dementia, or why I have dementia, I still appreciate life and want to live. And I thought that was remarkable. And I wanted to share his story. And even though the book just came out, after he finally went home and we had hospice care for about 8 months with him, I wrote an article on a site called medium.com to share the experience. And to this date, it has over 330,000 views. It gets as many views today as it did 10 years ago. But I got a lot of responses for people that had a loved one with Alzheimer's or dementia, and thanking me for the heartfelt story, but also for giving them some hope that maybe that person going through it does appreciate life and wants to live. It's like you expressed earlier, we don't know what's going on. So,
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-710-5100. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-710-5100. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-710-5100.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.
that was probably the most meaningful thing that came out of the experience for me, is to share that message with the world, so to speak. So it was really remarkable.
Yeah, I've had people ask me, if I had dementia, would I want to live or have, or exit, because people talk about suicide and all of those types of things with this. And they talked about, my mom and her disease in 30 years. And, would I still do everything the same with her? And I said, absolutely. I wouldn't cut it short. I said, for myself, I might, because I wouldn't want to be a burden to my kids. I said, but I have to make this really clear. I did not feel like my mom was a burden to me at all. And I wouldn't have given up 1 second. She taught me to live and be a better person. And I always thought I was a good person, but I think I'm a much better person from our relationship through this disease. I view things differently. I'm not as judgmental, though I have my moments, like everybody
Of course,
does.
we all do.
And I'm more flexible. I'm not as much of a control freak, I think, as I used to be. And I love the spontaneity because, every time something kind of went haywire, I'd be like ready to pull my hair out. And then I'm like, well, this is pretty cool. This wouldn't have happened if, and so I look at things differently. And so I think we project our grief and our loss on them and think they're feeling the same thing. And, I've kind of almost come to feel that they're here to teach us to live better, to be more accepting, to be more generous, to be less selfish, to, like with your dad, he made everyone feel valued, noticed, and heard.
That's right. Exactly right.
Everybody wants that.
And I agree with you because a doctor, my brother, even though he wasn't per se his physician, he got very involved in my father's care. There were times he was hospitalized through this, and sometimes my brother would say, I'm not sure he's going to make it through the night. His bodily functions are failing him. Miraculously, my father survived the next day. So he had that fighting spirit. But, my brother got very involved. I mean, he had his blood checked. If he was dehydrated, we got him saline solution. And I really credit my brother, who's a wonderful man, for really helping my father live so long. And the doctor says to me, what are you guys doing? This is no longer your father. This is not the Herbie we know. And it's not his right to say that, but we wanted my father for as long as we could have my father. Now, when someone's going through it, you're in a sense mourning the person they were. But the other thing that I think is important, and the other things I learned as a caregiving journey, was acceptance, So my father at the very end, he would just hold my hand and kiss it. And that meant the world to me. That was the essence of who he was, a loving man, So I tell people that are going through it, because it's stages or it's a downward thing, like you said, there are moments back and forth, but you got to accept your person for where they're at in time, because It's not good for them and it's not good for you. Because look, a person going through it, they might repeat certain things. They might ask the certain same questions over and over. And our natural tendency as human beings is to challenge someone. You're repeating yourself, or you ask me the same question over and over. And as you know, the person who has dementia or Alzheimer's, they can't control what they're doing. It's part of their mental condition at the time. So if you can accept where they're at, it's going to make it easier for them and make it easier for you. And the other thing I said is, accept yourself, give yourself some grace. You're not going to be perfect. There are going to be moments where you're not keeping it all together, and give yourself a break. People also say, oh, my loved one was so much better 6 months ago. I wish they were like that. Well, it's a progressive disease. You got to accept them for where they're at. So I'll tell you a story that I include the book about acceptance, if you got a second. So my mother was going to Texas to an aunt's party, and she asked me and my siblings to watch my father, and we each took a night, right? So the next time we all got together, we said, what did you do with Dad? And I said, oh, I took him to a movie. And my brother says, oh, we took him to a movie. My sister looked at us and says, oh, we took him to a movie too. What did you see? Said, well, I took him to Argo. That was the Ben Affleck movie at the time. And my brother says, we took him to Argo too. And then my sister looked at us and she shrugged her shoulders. Yep, we took him to Argo. And that was our immediate reaction. We laughed, right? Because from after he left the movies, he didn't remember from day to day. But I got to tell you something. When I drove home that night, I actually cried. I got sad. I said, because you know what? We're not really accepting him for who he is. Because if we accepted him for who he is, we would have taken him to different movies. Even though he enjoyed the experience being with us, we would have taken him to different movies because that would have really been accepting him who he is. Even though he may not remember from time to time, well, he's still a human being, and we shouldn't take him to the same movie. And I said, I'd like your opinion on this. I was in a support group and someone wrote, isn't it wonderful that a dementia person is like in their own world and they have... And I said, boy, that sounds good, but that's not my philosophy at all. My philosophy is that while your person is here, include them and treat them as part of life. I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, when you were talking about your brother and kind of giving him credit for your dad living as long, watching him medically. And I think that's a part. But to me, just from the short time we've talked, the reason your dad lived so long was because he was included. He still felt part of the family. I think that's why my mom lived 30 years. She felt connected. She felt loved. She felt purposeful, even in her end stages, because she was still included in the conversations. We learned to adapt to do things different, from dancing standing up to dancing with her in a wheelchair to doing an arm dance with her, and it got down to just a pinky connection, but it was all about the connection and finding the love and the laughter and the comfort. And I think what so many people miss in this journey is, they look at something and they want something more. They want something different. They want to rewind. And I always tell people, look in the mirror. You've disappointed many in your lives for the choices you've made that you thought were good. Dementia is not a choice. So,
right.
And you've accepted that person still in your life, so we have to look at things really different. And I think we're connected at a soul level. It's not just these words. I mean, there are so many ways, and I'm sure you felt it just from when you said, when your dad kissed your hand. It's those small moments. It's the glint in the eye. It's the giggle. It's the eye roll or whatever it might be. It's those little teeny weeny things that are so powerful that say, I'm here. I gotcha. I love you. I know what's going on, but it's not words.
You're right. And he towards the end, we used to say he made up his own language. He would say Maragunda, Maragunda. And we all laughed and enjoyed, and he laughed. He was making up this language, and we would kid around. And what I try to do, and I agree with it, to me, my message are acceptance and inclusion. So I lived about 2 hours away. They were in New York. I was in New Jersey. But I would try to go at least once a week, sometimes every week. And I would take my mother and father to a movie and to lunch. Okay. And then when we couldn't do that, we would watch a movie in the house and eat in the house. And even though I knew 5 minutes after leaving the movie he wouldn't remember, there were moments in the movie, especially if it was sad, that you'd see tears in his eyes. So that was important. But I'll tell you if a story about inclusion that's a real memory for our family. My father loved the horse racing, the horse track. Not the like Kentucky Derby type with thoroughbreds. There's something called trotters where guys sit in a cart and they pull a horse. And he loved that. And he took me as a kid and I went with my father. And then when my kids were little and grown up, he would take my kids. And we had fun and we had a day out and he was a pretty decent handicapper. There was always one race he thought particularly strong about. Usually the favorite, which means you would win the least money. But I would say out of 10 times, he would win 6 or 7 times that particular race. So when before my son started first grade, so he was like 5 or 6 years old, we went to the track. My daughter was too little and my father had a big day. And he won a lot. And after it's over, he says to my son, come on, we'll go to the toy store. I'll get you whatever you want. Go to the toy store. And my son buys like $100 Lego. He was big into Legos. First grade starts. The teacher has an exercise for students, says, what would you do if you had $100? My son says, I'd go to Freehold Raceway.
I love it.
It's a true story. I told my father the story. We had a good laugh. He goes, let's go next weekend. I said, we never go 2 weekends in a row. We went, didn't win a race. I said, Dad, I'm sorry we lost. He winks at me and says, I know. And he says to my son, he says, remember, when you go to the horse track, expect to lose. 10 years later, when we were at the 75th birthday party, my son, who's now 15, says, Grandpa, I know you occasionally like go to the casino and you like to play poker. I want to tell you one thing, Grandpa, expect to lose.
What a great life lesson, though, you know?
So now the story of inclusion. So this is, he's now in, the later stages. And one time he said to me, just out of nowhere, let's go to the track. Okay. I knew 3 seconds after he asked me, he wouldn't remember. And it was at this point, my mother wasn't really driving long distances. I'd have to go 2 hours to get them, 2 hours back to the track near my house in New Jersey. I said, you know what? I'm going to do it. He likes the horses and I'm going to include him. So you want to know another way how I judged his dementia, Lori? Over the years, he would circle less and less things on the race form as his mental declined to the point where he just knew the odds. It used to be how many times the horse won and his times, but over the time. So we go to the track and it's my mother, it's me and my kids and my father. And the first race comes and he can't even contemplate the odds at this point. We said, Dad, it's a first race. What horse do you want? Pick a number. He goes, number 7, right? My mother, who would sit there usually reading her book, pops her head up and goes, number 7? He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's the longest shot in the race. It's like 45-1. So my son says, Grandma, what are you talking about? When Grandpa says a horse is going to win in a race and feel strongly, it usually does. And I said, Mom, yeah, when Dad handicaps a race, it's going to win. So we put a little more money on that race, right? The race goes off. Of course, our horse is in last place. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, the horse comes down the stretch, wins by a nose. All right? We're all excited. There's no emotion on my father's face. My son says, Grandpa, the horse you picked, the longest horse in the race, won by a nose. The biggest smile came to his face. Can I tell you something? That made our whole day.
Oh,
that moment made it all worthwhile. In fact, my son told that story when my father passed in his eulogy. And that, including him there and that big smile on his face, made it worthwhile, even though he wouldn't remember anything ever. It didn't matter because in that moment he did. So
And you're still talking about it and
still
sharing.
talking about it. Yeah, it's a story I will never forget because it was really remarkable, and it was a story we cherish and a memory we cherish.
Oh yeah, we had we had stories like that with my mom. One of them, when you were talking about going to the movies, I brought her to oh, what was it? The Christmas with the Cranks, where they put the snow man.
Right, right.
And my mom had trouble with mobility, so I'd have her arm and help her in and out of a chair. And we're watching the show, and it comes to the point where they're protesting because the Cranks they're going on vacation. They're not spending their money on the Christmas decorations. They're not putting Frosty up. And there's this big protest going on. And all of a sudden I hear this voice in the audience, and it's my mom who's sitting right next to me, who got out of her chair on her own. And she's swinging her arm and she is protesting with everybody. And I was like, oh my gosh. And my niece is looking at me like, what's going on? And I'm like, I'm not sure. And it didn't last long. And she sat down. But she got woo-hoos out of the audience and claps and stuff. And it was like she was in the moment. That big screen was real. And my mom was always politically active. She would have been the one coordinating the protest, probably in the neighborhood. And, you could be really embarrassed about that, or you can just enjoy the moment. Right. And I mean, it was just one of those things we'll all cherish, because the personality came out.
Yeah.
And the proof in the pudding with, the horse winning the race, and yet not really meaning anything to him or him being able to process. But then that big smile of it sunk in. Yep.
It did. Once we told him that long shot won, he knew what we were saying, and the biggest smile, and that made it all worthwhile. It really did. You said something earlier about how the experience changed you, right, in going through it. So I didn't write the book until 10 years later, right? So I sat with the article, and the article was heartwarming to see the reaction. But, I've been a businessman and entrepreneur, and I did some consulting, and after my last consulting gig, then I said, you know what? I'd like to share this story and maybe write a book. But then I said to myself, I don't think this story is enough to fill a whole book. But I got other great family stories, and I've learned so much about my father. But who would be interested in my family stories? Because they're family stories. So the interesting that you asked me in the beginning what my definition of an awakening is, right? So when I looked up the definition of awakening, right, you typically think of a spiritual or a religious awakening, or it's literally a getting up, like my father got up from his dementia. But it's also a recognition, realization, or awareness of something. So it doesn't only have to be these major big events.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-710-5100. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-710-5100. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-710-5100.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.
So I actually was looking for a publisher for the book. I found a publisher, and when I was talking to them, the editor said to me, Dan, what this experience with your father has really allowed you to do is reflect on other family moments. And when I reflected on other family moments, I realized that I had almost like mini awakenings or mini lessons from all the experience. Most of it with my father, but some with a loved uncle and my mother. And I said, you know what? In the context of reflecting on my father's awakening, it allowed me to reflect on these other family stories, and then I can share them with the reader. But the other thing I did, and that's what you're doing naturally, is I left reflection pages. So whenever I had a chapter, I wanted to bring in the audience by saying, how did this event affect your life? So again, talking about, there's a chapter about small acts of kindness. So getting back to the track, and that seems to be a theme through my book. We would go to the track over the years, and my father liked to valet the car. Even though the general entrance was a much quicker walk from the valet, you had to walk like 100 yards. And we always seemed to be valeted by the same guy, even though we're multiple guys. So we would go, once or twice or three times a year. So he started to get to know us. And I don't think I ever asked his name, but he always took care of us. As my father started to deteriorate, right? He would see me. It was usually my mother and my kids in the back seat, me and my father in the front seat. Eventually, I started to drive. My mother would drive out. And eventually, he would help me take out the walker or help me take out the wheelchair. At a certain point, he would look into the car and he'd motion me to get in back. He'd get in, he'd drive us the 100 yards to the front. And then eventually, I don't know how he knew it when we were leaving to the day. He showed up with the car. He would fold the wheelchair or fold the walker and put it in the car. And I don't think he knew that he had dementia. He just knew that he was frail or he was sick. And maybe he admired his courage. But those small acts of kindness, when I reflected back on it, were so meaningful. So I share that story and I ask people, when has a situation or small act of kindness affected your family? Or when I talk about, acceptance, how is accepting your loved one changing? How is including them? And you know what, Lori, I don't think it only has to be with someone that has dementia or Alzheimer's. It could be other mental conditions. It could be physical disease, like someone with cancer or disabilities. I think these apply to other people. So I try to share other things and stories. I had a beloved uncle who always showed up when we needed him. Like if we came home 2 in the morning from a trip or 2 in the afternoon, he was always waiting for us, even if we never told him what time we're coming home. And we always, so the importance of showing up. So I try to share those other kind of stories in the book and try to bring in the audience and let them reflect on their own lives and with their loved ones. And so that's also been great to see.
I think that's brilliant. I've always said what's good for dementia is good for the world, because the lessons you learn, the insights you get can be applied in so many different ways. Like you with, I wrote a book called Betty the Bald Chicken, Lessons in How We Care, which is just a little children's book. But I waited 10 years to publish it. And by the time I published it, it's like, oh my gosh, this isn't just for dementia. This can be used for bullying in school, divorce, death, chronic illness, just a job location, graduating from college, any of those times when you don't feel like you fit or you're not as confident and uncomfortable. I mean, there's so many overlaps with all of this stuff.
That's right.
And I think once people realize that, they don't feel as isolated and desolated, because they're looking at other people's journeys different now. That, yeah, it might not be exactly like mine, and none of them are going to be exactly like yours, even within the world of dementia. It's, it's just the experience of living this human life. We all go through these. I think dementia, I would say, amplifies emotions, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
And everybody has those emotions, but society says, nope, you can't show those, you can't feel those. And
Mm.
that's when people get really bottlenecked and um, really feel at a loss. And I think, it's okay to talk about those things. I think it's healthy to feel those things. Otherwise they come out sideways and then all of a sudden you can be in real trouble. So I think
Right.
it's wonderful that you're sharing these stories and then allowing people to think in their own life, how does that apply, or what has moved me, what has shifted me, what stage am I in my life.
That's right. That's very good. Yeah. And I'll tell you the other thing that came out of this book. I have a chapter called A Living Eulogy for My Dad.
Mhm.
So, both my parents have passed. I lost a very close friend, but even before that, we've all attended our share of funerals, and sometimes I know the deceased, sometimes I knew their loved one. And I would listen to these eulogies, and even if I didn't know the person, I was brought to tears. And I said to myself, wow, the person who really should be hearing these beautiful words is the person who passed away. It says, why do we wait for that moment to share how we feel about someone? We would tell our loved ones, we love them, or you did a good job here, or things like that. But when has anyone sat down and really shared that experience? So I had that opportunity actually twice. So at my father's 75th birthday party, we each got a chance to share how we felt about him. And it was really beautiful because 5 months later, he had a stroke. But I also wrote both my parents a letter when I turned 40, just to express how I felt about them. And they said that was the best birthday present they ever got. So I say to people, you know what? While you're, and it doesn't have to be an older person, it could be a younger person, it doesn't have to be a parent, it could be a child, it could be a friend, a loved one, a colleague. Share how you feel about them. Write them a letter. If you don't want, if you're embarrassed to do it face to face, send them an email. Write a handwritten note, which believe me, people appreciate tonight. Because give the opportunity while someone is living to still share how you feel about them. And I think that's important because don't wait till it's too late. Like you said, your person going through dementia, tell them how you feel and be present in the life. But I think it's important. And it's one of the things when I reflected on, I said, I think more people should do it while their person is around.
Oh, I agree too. And then use all of your senses too, like with my mom, to try to stay connected and because, words sometimes can be difficult to process. We think we don't really know for sure.
Right.
But there's lots of different ways to be intimate with somebody and show that you care. So like I would always bring a little bottle of lotion. And I lotioned my mom up in her arms and stuff. My daughter would always bring her fingernail polish and, do grandma's nails. My brothers weren't so touchy feely. So, we got a little CD player with some Frank Sinatra in there. They could push
Right.
but that was something that she appreciated. And so there's a lot of different ways to be able to do that. I've had
Right.
people say, well, we're not a touchy feely family. And one woman, she said, my mom, I couldn't see her for like 2 years because she was going through cancer. So her sister kind of took over and she was kind of the main person. And then when she came kind of back into things, her mom was just kind of curled up in bed. And she's like, I just want to tell her I love her. I want to hug her. And I'm like, crawl in bed with her. To me, it was just,
Right.
and she's like, oh, we don't do that. I said, honey, I said, you will regret it the rest of your life if you don't.
Right.
And and I'll never forget this because I was at a conference and I was communicating with her and I got done with my conference at night and I'm like, oh, I got a message from Michelle. I can't wait to hear what's going on. And she said, I crawled in bed with her. I gave her a hug. I told her how much I loved her. And she responded. It wasn't huge, but she responded. She felt so good. And I said, it's so common because a lot of times, especially with our older population, they weren't touchy feely. But it's always been something that when I worked in real estate for 25 years, people would tell me they wish they would have broken certain trends of the family.
Yeah.
And they appreciate it when somebody steps forward and just lets them know how much they're loved. I mean, we all want to feel loved and purposeful. And that's not going to do any damage telling somebody that, you know?
I'll tell you an interesting story about that, and I share it also in my book. So my father grew up in a family where they weren't touchy-feely, and he loved his parents. Obviously, he grew up the youngest of three brothers, and his mother used to berate one of his brothers, and my father particularly, that was ended up being his best friend in life, his Uncle Benny. So he grew up in that environment. But my father did something as a young man that most people did at the time. When he was 20 years old, 1950, he got therapy. And through therapy, he was able to overcome that situation, and he became demonstratively loving man, which probably would not have happened unless he had therapy. So he recognized therapy early on in his life. My mother also didn't come from a touchy-feely family, so that part rubbed off on my mother. My mother was well educated. That rubbed off on my father, but yeah, so I'm also a very believer in therapy. I believe if you have something going on, speak to someone. It's good to get a third party objective's opinion. And I also am a guy who's not afraid to be sensitive and to show my feelings. But my father interesting learned about therapy early in life, and that's been a philosophy of our whole family. If there's an issue, we'll do therapy.
Yep. Talk about it. Yeah. Work through it. Stuff and it doesn't do any good. It just comes sideways. So, oh gosh, I could just talk with you all day long. I just feel so aligned with you. I want to mention your podcast and where people can find that, what they can expect, what it's called.
Sure. So just quickly, if I can, the book is Awakenings in Real Life. You could find it on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, select bookstores. You can also find it on my website, awakeningsinreallife.com. So very quickly was after I had written the book, I saw a report on TV about a guy who had a spinal condition, decided to give up his corporate life, learn how to sail, and sail across the Pacific. And his story went viral. And I said to myself, man, he had his own awakening in life. And I'll bet you there's stories that other people have awakenings that are very profound. And I said, you know what? I like to talk. I'm not shy. I bet you I could share those stories. So I started to educate myself in a podcast. And I started a podcast called Awakenings in Real Life, where I tell inspiring stories of transformation, meaning, and hope. So I have near-death experience. I got people who overcame loss. I got someone how he his awakening was always connected with his autistic child. Guy who was bullied his whole life, and then later in life had an awakening. He became a humanitarian clown. So he went from being invisible to as visible as you can. So I share these kind of stories. My podcast is on YouTube, Awakenings in Real Life, Apple, Spotify, but you could also find my episodes on my website, Awakenings in Real Life. We're on all social media under that name. If you've had an awakening or you want to share some stories with your caregiver, anybody, I welcome speaking to people. They can email me at info@awakeningsinreallife. And, I want this to be an inclusive thing. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the podcast a little bit.
Oh no, it's the work you're doing is so important. So I appreciate you joining me today and spending this much time. Is there any last thing that you would like to say to our audience that you feel it's important for them to know before we wrap up?
Basically it's the things I've told you. Try to stay in the moment with your loved one, accept them from where you're at. Include them where you're at. But maybe the message that I got out of our experience is that I think your loved one still appreciate life and wants to live and is probably more aware of what's going on. And if you treat them with that kind of respect, you're going to have a better experience for them and a better experience for yourself.
And I think that's key, that that appreciation, it doesn't just affect them. I know when I was caring, especially in the beginning, I felt I was doing everything for my mom, and I wasn't seeing what I was getting back out of that. But I think that's part of our societal stigma of they can't participate, they can't give back. That's what we're taught, and that's just not.
Right.
That's I think there's so many things that we have to deal with, and we have to educate people on the possibilities of what's still there and what you can learn, and that you will receive if you don't block the wall.
Right. I agree with you completely. And I've so enjoyed our discussion. I want to thank you for having me on the show. And what you're doing is really a terrific thing. Speaking to people that are going through it, and caregivers, and everything you do, and you're helping to bring light to the subject, and not only from a clinical point of view. And I think that's so important. So I thank you for doing what you're doing as well.
Well, it takes us all, and all our different voices and different approaches. Everybody learns different, takes things in. And I don't know about you, but many times I need to hear things more than once and in different ways.
Sure, of course. Of course.
I might hear something or read something, and part of it clicks, but not all of it. And then all of a sudden it pops up again, and I hear it in a different voice, and I get another little piece. But I think we're all lifelong learners, if we want to believe that or not. But once you consciously look at life like that there's always something to learn from everybody before you in every situation, and it could be good, it could be bad, it could be ugly, but it's going to help create your path in the future, to be more steady and strong and kind, and hopefully patient. I know everyone wants more patience in this process.
A big one.
Yep.
Yeah. And to give yourself a break too, because we're not going to be perfect. It's hard not to. It's a difficult situation, and you got to give yourself a break sometimes. All these things sound great, but nobody's perfect. I describe my father, sounds like he was a perfect man before he had the dementia. He wasn't. He was flawed. He was a human being, and we got to give ourselves, do the best we can. And that's what he told his children. Do the best you can. And that's my advice to people. Do the best you can.
Well, and I think we put that perfection term out there because disease is serious when you're caring for someone else, and you don't want to screw up. But like you said, life wasn't perfect before dementia. You can't expect it to be now. You're dealing with less skill sets, and you're dealing with more stress. So that's probably going to up the odds. But reframing things, and not just looking at completing tasks on behalf of someone else, but and this was a big lesson for me. I had to, and I didn't learn this until I lost it one time with my mom, and I snapped on her when she repeated herself 45 times in 10 minutes. But I reevaluated things and created a tool called your memory chip. And it made me, after I interviewed people all around the world, professionals and families, to focus not so much on my tasks, even though they needed to be done, because then I was just checking them off, and I was being really more robotic than I thought. But first and foremost, showing up to do anything. Was she safe? Was she happy? Was she pain-free? And then that changed how I did everything, and got us back to being in a relationship instead of just giving care, because it's not,
great.
It's in all of life, it's how we do things, how we show up. It's not necessarily what we did, but it's how we showed up is what people really remember.
Very wise words, Laurie.
Yeah, well, I'm getting older now, I got a couple of them.
I get it. Believe me, I get it. I do.
Well, Dan, again, thank you so much. I would urge people to go get his book and listen to his podcast. We'll have all the contact information in the notes and things for you. And again, you're always welcome back on the show. I'm sure you got a zillion more stories to tell. And
I have some good ones.
Yeah, I think it's very, very helpful for people to hear the real side of life and in these special little moments. So thanks again, Dan.
Thank you.
So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you become a giver of hope. Like, click, and share this episode. People need to hear Danny's stories and learn about his book and his podcast about real life examples of living with a chronic illness and how it can impact your life for the better, and the life lessons, wrapped in all of that, and coping mechanisms, and just ideas to soothe your soul, I guess. And then, of course, I always recommend that you check out Alzheimer's Speaks and go to our free educational resources, as well as our sister company, Dementia Map. With that, I'll say goodbye, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-710-5100. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-710-5100. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-710-5100.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states. Not available in California.